in general, talking about COVID has not been a positive storyline for this White House. And if you watched the Republican convention, you saw that there was, quite candidly, I felt like there was not a lot of references to COVID, but when there were references, there was an attempt to spin it in terms of, the administration's sort of strength and responsibility in handling this crisis. When the president himself then actually is diagnosed with this virus, I think the idea of spinning the White House's success in handling this virus becomes really hard. And it also just becomes harder to shift the conversation to something else, whether the president wants to be talking about law and order, as he did this summer. It's harder to talk about that when the president himself now has COVID.
Asma, there was an incredibly chaotic response to the president's positive diagnosis of COVID-19 over the weekend. When he was diagnosed, when he knew he was diagnosed, what his symptoms were, the treatments he was receiving, and why. The White House staff didn't receive any kind of instructions about protocols they should be following until Sunday night. The president's surprise drive-by, which the Walter Reed attending physician called insanity and political theater, and it also put the lives of Secret Service agents at risk. What impact will all these things, in your view, Asma, have on voters?
I think that's an excellent question, Katie. And I guess I think of this in two ways. One is based on the reporting I did, actually. I was out in Michigan this past week, and I did very quickly turn around a story for the weekend, looking at a sense of how people were initially responding even to the president's diagnosis of COVID-19. And my, I say initial takeaway is that any assumption that the president's diagnosis might dramatically change the polarization that's in this country just around the virus, mask wearing, social distancing, to me that seems very slim. And I say that, Katie, because the Republicans that I met with wanted to meet indoors. They did not wear masks. One offered to shake my hand when I first met them. The Democrats that I met with either met in outdoors or wanted to meet indoors with masks. So to me, that this was just sort of a small little microcosm of the initial way that behavior didn't seem to be changing based on the president's diagnosis. But the other factor, I think, Katie, that to me is a little bit more unclear, and maybe we'll get a better sense of this in the weeks to come, is just how the president responds to his own treatment, how he responds politically to that, right? He did come out and say that he understands the significance of COVID, and whether or not that actually makes him alter his own political rhetoric remains to be seen. But if he were, hypothetically, let's say, to dramatically change course around, say, mask wearing and encourage the American public widely to see this as a patriotic duty, then, perhaps it's possible that this might have a different effect on voters. I will say at this moment in time, I don't think we've seen a dramatic change in rhetoric from the president, and I haven't seen a dramatic change based on the anecdotal interviews I did with voters in Michigan.
So far, you're saying, Asma, this will not impact the behavior of people who are not taking COVID-19 seriously, and ergo, it probably won't affect the degree to which they're supporting the president.
I think so. And Katie, right, there is a slim percentage of people there in the middle. I'm talking about sort of maybe base Republican voters and base Democratic voters. I think their opinions are largely baked in at this point. And we know that because I think from a lot of polling we've seen for months now, there are not a lot of undecided voters, truly undecided voters. Those who are in the middle, I think, it'll be interesting to see if the president's response either elicits any sympathy, say, from folks who are undecided, or if it elicits anger from some people who are undecided at this point. There is no doubt that for some voters, the president's, in their view, mishandling of the pandemic has been a motivating factor. And so even for some voters who might have been on the fence about participating in this election cycle, I'm curious if the way that this is all handled might motivate them one way or the other. I just don't have a clear sense of that yet.
This small sliver of undecided voters, is it enough to turn the election in either direction, Asma?
I think there are, and in part because there are two buckets, I would say, of undecided voters, right? There are voters who are perhaps genuinely torn between President Trump and former Vice President Joe Biden. Quite candidly, in my interviews, I think there are very few of those types of people, but they do exist. But the other sort of bucket of voters that I'm really interested in are people who sat out the 2016 election or voted third party at the top of the ticket. These are people who did vote for Barack Obama, say in 2008, but ultimately did not like Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. And those voters and the way that they decide to go this election cycle, to me, will be extremely important to watch, in part because if you look at the margins in 2016 in three key states, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, those are states all that Donald Trump won, but he won them by very slim margins. So it doesn't take a whole lot of voters in those three states in order to flip the election one way or the other.
I know in polls that were taken following the debate, which most people thought was a real train wreck, that Joe Biden was up by 14 points. When will we know how this latest news about the president and COVID-19 will impact the polls?
I agree with you, Katie. That movement right after the debate to me was fascinating. But to your point, those polls account for the really slim days that we had right after the debate and before we heard about the president's diagnosis. So once we get some additional polling out, I think we'll have a better sense of how people are responding to the president's virus. But again, though, Katie, I would say to me, this is a storyline that may differ. So, whether or not the president hypothetically sees perhaps a sympathy bounce right after the diagnosis is valid, and that may be the case. But whether or not those voters continue to believe in him, say 3 weeks from now, to me is very debatable.
You spent time in Michigan talking to white suburban women. President Trump won those voters by significant margins in 2016. What are they saying now?
What I heard a lot of is a sort of activation of these women that developed after the 2016 election. These are women who weren't particularly engaged in politics before Donald Trump won. These were the women who ultimately helped Democrats take back the House in 2018, and they are extremely energized heading into the 2020 election. I think what's interesting to me is that these are sort of grassroots organizations of women who got together. Some of them joined these local indivisible chapters, but some of them are really just women who did not ever think of themselves as extremely political. But because of this moment now, they have begun to say, call their friends on the phone, or they've become, engaged in local campaigns. And really, if you look at Michigan, to me, is a really interesting place because a lot of the leadership that is in charge now, Democrats, they are women. And women feel like they helped put the governor over the edge. They helped put, the Secretary of State, they helped get a lot of these women into office. And they're really focused now on the state house. And if you look at where they're focused on winning the state house, it is largely in traditionally Republican suburban districts outside of Detroit.
So how are these suburban women feeling about the election that's right in front of us? Are some of them having regrets that they supported President Trump?
Katie, I will say I have not met loads of people who have buyer's remorse. I have met a couple of people who did vote for President Trump in 2016, who told me that they felt he would be a change agent. And it turned out for them that he was not really bringing about the change that they had hoped for. Some people also thought that he would be a champion for the working class. They feel ultimately that he has not proven that. But by and large, what I am finding is sort of this energy and enthusiasm amongst Democratic women that is outweighing the energy and enthusiasm that I'm seeing from Republican women.
How will White House officials put a positive spin on everything that's happened in recent days?
Well, Katie, I honestly don't know what the tactics are going to be for the White House. But what I have heard from some Republicans is this notion that if the president is able to get through this, on the other side, he's still healthy, they feel like it will show that perhaps, he's a fighter, that he's able to withstand the pandemic, and that he was tough. These are all sort of, words I've heard from different Republican women. And the sense that is that perhaps by actually coming out on the other end of this virus, it gives him some additional credibility as just a man of strength and vigor. And they think that those are important qualifications that people will want in a candidate.
That's something he certainly tried to assert during the campaign, that he is stronger and more vigorous, and by emphasizing Joe Biden's age, when in reality, they're just 3 years apart.
Yeah, and the other thing we have heard a lot from Republicans leading up to the president's own diagnosis has been a critique that Joe Biden was, quote unquote hiding in his basement, that he wasn't out there campaigning enough, that the Biden campaign didn't really have much of a field operation, knocking on doors and that, look, here we are, the Trump campaign, we've been out there in public, we've been knocking on doors, and the president has a much more rigorous campaign schedule. So how that perhaps changes in the coming weeks could be interesting.
They're sort of flipping. Joe Biden is doing more live events, and President Trump is doing more virtual events. It's sort of very appropriate for this topsy-turvy world we see.
It is. I mean, but Katie, there are, to me, really interesting questions about after the president, receives a negative COVID test, let's say, and moves forward beyond the point where he doesn't need to quarantine anymore. Does he begin to hold in-person rallies again? And does he sort of just bounce back to campaigning the way that we had seen him out on the trail for the past couple of months?
I guess that time will tell in terms of how he's feeling. Asma, let's talk about the upcoming vice presidential debate. I understand the space between Mike Pence and Kamala Harris will be expanded to 12 feet. Do you know any other changes that will be put in place to, say, prevent constant interruptions, the sort we saw in the presidential debate?
Mike Pence has a very different demeanor than President Trump. So I will say whether or not there needs to be sort of rule changes put in place as to the format, I don't know that those need to be put in place necessarily for moving forward on this VP debate.
What are some of the challenges both Mike Pence and Kamala Harris will face in this debate?
I think for Kamala Harris, what's at stake has been that she and Joe Biden have been heavily critiquing the president's response to COVID-19. So how she is able to both critique the president's response while also potentially not alienating people who may, feel that they ought to be perhaps empathetic to the president's condition right now will be really fascinating to watch. On the flip side, for Vice President Mike Pence, I think how he defends the president's COVID response, how he defends the administration's COVID response, given that he was in fact in charge of that White House coronavirus task force, will be fascinating. And I anticipate there will be definitely plenty of questions about that given the president's health situation.
Let's move on finally to the confirmation process for Judge Amy Coney Barrett. How will this impact that?
Well, in terms of the actual confirmation, Katie, we do know that a couple of members of the Senate Judiciary Committee have also tested positive to COVID-19. In terms of what effect, though, if any of this will actually have, we also know that Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has every intent of moving forward as quickly as possible on confirming Judge Amy Coney Barrett. And, the Republicans have the numbers to do that. Part of my reporting out in Michigan was to get a sense of how, if at all, this might motivate voters. And what I largely heard is that it's a baked-in assumption. It's not necessarily going to sway Republicans or Democrats one way or the other. Democrats, that being said, though, feel very much like Republicans are trying to seat this judge before November 3rd, so that if potentially this election needs to go to the Supreme Court, President Trump, in their view, will have a favorable judge to possibly rule on anything. And that is something that I did hear from some Democrats very much worries them, and therefore they want to turn out, they say, in huge, huge numbers, so that this isn't really a question of the election needing to go to the courts.